thanks everybody, and I'm Jim Emberger, and I want to thank you all for taking time out on this lovely day to come hear a little bit of our conversation. As Sean said, the topic today in general is shale gas, and my part of it is talking about regulations, but essentially what we're going to be talking about is language. I mean, language is how we humans communicate, and more importantly, it's how we judge the truth or falsity of something that we haven't experienced ourselves. And so it must be carefully used, because like language, like any tool, can be used in many different ways. I mean, on the one hand, we have logic that uses language to arrive at the truth, hopefully. But formal logic can be, while it works really well, it can be kind of abstract, and there's lots of rules and techniques, etc. And if it's used badly, what you do is get its opposite, which is something called sophistry, where basically you're using language to deceive someone or to obscure the real truth. And in between these, we have another word that's probably you're more familiar with. It's called rhetoric. And rhetoric is just language that's used to persuade people. And so it can be either good logic or it could be faulty sophistry. So I like to call these last two, sophistry and rhetoric, loaded language. And we face loaded language every day in everything we do. But fortunately, there are some simple critical thinking techniques that we can use and common sense questioning that can decode this language and help us make good decisions. So my current focus today, being on shale gas, will apply some of those techniques, and hopefully you'll be able to take them with you to other pursuits. So when I thought about what to talk about with shale gas, what things concern me, I mean, there's an entire universe of things. Public health being at the top, air pollution, water contamination, water use, industrialization of the rural landscape, a boom and bust economy, the effects on agriculture and tourism, and of course the overarching concern that for all of us is climate change. So what to pick to talk about? Well, as I did this, I realized that there is one topic that addresses all the above, and is something in which I have experience, which is the regulatory process, regulations. Now normally, when you say to someone you're going to talk about regulations, their eyes glaze over and they sort of tune out, because everybody thinks that they don't have either the scientific or the legal background to really understand what these are about. And actually, if you were to get down to the specifics of what should the thickness of the wellbore construction be from an engineering standpoint, I'm in that same boat. But unfortunately, that leaves everybody in the state that, well, we just have to trust that what the government is telling us is the truth, because we can't make a decision about this on our own. Well, as Bob Dylan famously said in one of his songs, is that you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. And you don't need to be a scientist or a lawyer to understand the intent and the effectiveness of regulations. Simply by asking good questions and applying common sense that we all have to examine the language that's being used to sell these regulations, and also the language that's in the regulations themselves, you can get quite a bit of information. So today we're going to go behind the language, past the short sentences and the sound bites, to understand the context in which the language exists. Because context surrounding the words are generally more important than the words themselves. And context is the first of the critical thinking techniques we're going to talk about. Before continuing, I just want to give you a little example of this. It's something that stuck with me since my high school English teacher said it to me many, many years ago when he was teaching us how to read newspapers critically. This is a Cold War example, tells you how old I am, where the United States and Russia and the Soviet Union were having a one-on-one automobile race. It was one of those things that they did endlessly back then to prove who had the superior technology or the superior way of life. But anyway, they had this head-to-head automobile race. Then the United States won. The headline in the Soviet papers the next day read as follows: Soviet Union comes in second in international race. United States comes in next to last. So think about that for a minute. It's a perfectly true sentence, except that it gives exactly the opposite impression of what really happened. So that's what we're talking about when we say context is important. Without knowing the context of that statement, it's totally false. So we'll return to that later, but now we'll move into the crux of the talk here, which is that the government frames its case for shale gas with the following sentences. It says, having the strictest regulations based on best practices will allow the safe and responsible development of shale gas. Now, I'm sorry about the air quotes, I hate them, but since I don't have a PowerPoint demonstration, what they're intended to tell you is that these are actually the government's words, they're not my words. So, to start our conversation, we really need to talk about, well, what are regulations? A quick dictionary definition is that they're rules that are based on and meant to carry out a specific piece of legislation, such as environmental protection, and they're usually enforced by a regulatory agency that's mandated to carry out the regulations. So in essence, regulations are a type of law. And so, well, do laws keep us safe? That's a good first common sense question to ask. Do laws keep us safe? Well, yeah, they do. Well, but at the same time, we still have prisons that are filled with thousands of people who have broken the law. The law didn't deter them from doing whatever they wanted to do. But we're still safe from them because the government takes them out of society and removes them, from our environment, and that's what keeps us safe. Well, our regulations aren't dealing with individuals, they're dealing with corporations. Now, corporations, although they've come to be considered individuals under the law in some instances, have one big difference, is that you can't put a corporation in jail if they break a regulation. So the government needs to come up with another way to control what corporations do. In almost all cases, this means fines. But you get into a sticky problem here, because unlike murderers and thieves, which the government is happy to remove from society, they really want the corporations to hang around because they're collecting taxes, they're collecting royalties, the corporation may be providing jobs or investment in the local economy. So, they kind of want to not be too tough on them. And at the same time, they don't want other businesses who are looking at the situation to be scared off because saying, oh, someday I may be in that situation. So they have a real incentive to not be too hard. But unfortunately, there are unintended consequences from this. Because the primary concern of any corporation, its primary responsibility, is what they call its fiduciary responsibility. In plain terms, it's the bottom line for their stockholders. So you don't have to have an MBA from Harvard to understand that if the cost of a fine is less than the money you saved by breaking the law, it's a good business decision to break the law. And we already, although the industry isn't even here yet in New Brunswick, basically, we already have had a good example of this already. 2 years ago, a company called Windsor Energy decided to do some seismic testing down in the Sussex area without waiting to get approval from the local municipality. Well, the Minister of Natural Resources was outraged and threatened to pull their licenses and all other kinds of nasty things. Well, in the end, they didn't do anything to the company, but that's another story. We'll save for another time. Let's assume that they did punish the company and fine them $10,000. Well, that would be a pretty big fine for this kind of violation. I mean, it's not like they were pouring toxic waste into the water or anything. It was just pretty much an administrative violation. But since the minister was so mad, let's say they fined him $20,000. Well, the CEO from Windsor the next day after all this happened went on the radio and said that he had equipment and people in the area, and if he had to wait 2 days to get permission, it was going to cost him $65,000. So had we fined him $20,000 and he saved $65,000, that's a $45,000 good business decision he made to break the law. Now, I'm not singling out the shale gas industry for this because, this is true across almost all industries of this type. Few ever pay any kind of punishment that's commensurate with the size of their violation. The best we can usually do with any kind of regulation is to get compensation after the fact, like if they've actually hurt some people or property or the environment. But even that's not a guarantee because, as you probably all know, industry will fight these fines in court and drag out justice, sometimes for decades. All the time the government has to spend money to do this in court. So now we have like a second incentive for the government not to push too hard on the industry. Now, we can prove this by an analogy and do some ground truthing. Ground truthing is a term that's often used just in the environmental area to say basically if you got a theory, that's great, but you got to go out and compare it to the real live evidence to see if it holds. So let's talk about analogies in other places where we've had shale gas. In states like that are oil and gas friendly, like Texas, they'll rack up maybe 55,000 violations in a year. They only enforce 2% of these. In Pennsylvania, the biggest producer of shale gas, which has thousands of violations every year, 13% of the companies got fined. in North Dakota, which our minister Leonard just visited and was just thrilled with, that we should try to emulate them. In a single year, they had 1,000 spills, just spills of either oil or chemicals or wastewater. Yet in all the past 3 years, including those 1,000 violations, there were less than 50 disciplinary actions for all violations in the state of North Dakota. And not to leave out Canada, because people always say, well, Canada's different, we do things better up here. In British Columbia, where essentially the only place in Canada that they're doing shale gas development at the moment, they prosecute less than 1% of the violations that are considered serious or major. So we start out with this context that legislations are more like guidelines or suggestions than laws that will actually bring sure and swift punishment as we consider other kinds of laws. So the second thing to ask then is like, what gets regulated? Now, what is the first of these questions that you may remember from school if you took journalism, where they said, you should always ask what, when, where, why, and how. And that's important to get context. So we start out here with what gets regulated. Well, it bears repeating over and over, you can't say it enough, I don't think, that this industry would not even exist were it not for the fact that before it started, it got itself exempted from the toughest standards available at that time, which were the federal standards in the United States of America. Now, these are they got exempted from these laws that every other industry has to abide by. So the common sense, and common sense is another one of our critical thinking techniques, the common sense question to me right away is, well, if this industry is so safe, why did they have to get themselves exempted from the environmental regulations before they could even start? I mean, until that question, fundamental question, gets answered and corrected, to me, there's nothing else that the industry or the government could say to convince me that this is safe. So that's where we start. Now, this happened in the United States, but the U.S. is the model for this industry. And in Canada, the federal government has followed suit. In the last year, by the passing bills C-45 and C-38, which you don't need to remember, but that's what they were. They basically took the federal government out of the regulatory industry for environmental concerns and turned it over to the provinces. So now in both US and Canada, it's the states and the provinces who are responsible for environmental regulation. Well, the states and provinces have little experience in this area. The industry's only been around for 10 or 12 years. So what happens in this case is that regulations are often written with the active participation and advice of the industry, because they're the ones that know what's going on. And in every jurisdiction where this has occurred, it has eroded public trust in the government, because the public sees what's going on. You get this revolving door effect between the people who are regulating industry and writing the rules and the people in the industry themselves. We have an example of this already here again in New Brunswick, even though it's a new industry. About a year or so ago, a woman named Angie Leonard, who was working on the Natural Gas Working Group. This is the government group that's designed to write the regulations, left that group to become a lobbyist for the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Now, unfortunately for her, she was the sister of the energy minister, so it became public knowledge. Otherwise, they would have just probably snuck that through and nobody would have known about it. But that's what happens all the time. Our provincial government has done its own job of deregulating. Since the all-world government's been in, they have basically gutted the Wetlands Protection Act, essentially just saying that 50% of the wetlands that used to be wetlands aren't anymore, with no further research or anything. And they've also refused to complete a legally mandated by the legislation process to classify the health of New Brunswick's rivers. That hasn't been done. Now, seeing as how water use and water pollution are, it's one of the vital concerns of shale gas production, is this coincidental that they did that? I can't answer that. Maybe you have an idea. So, to start now, we know that regulations are more like guidelines. Many vital areas are not regulated. Our potential regulatory tools and standards have been weakened, and this is where we start to look at New Brunswick's strictest regulations that are contained in their document called the Rules for Industry. Well, what is important, what is more important sometimes in a document is what is not in the document as much as what is in it. This is another context question. In the rules from the industry, from the very beginning, there are big omissions. The first page where they do their little introduction, they quote from a 2011 report from a group called the International Energy Agency, in which they say, basically, wow, there's sure a lot of shale gas out there. It's going to be a golden age of shale gas. Now, using these kind of quotes are legitimate rhetoric. We talked about rhetoric earlier, but you can never divorce things from context. And this same group, the following year in 2012, before our regulations came out, issued a second report that said, it doesn't matter how much gas and oil and coal is out there in the ground, we can't burn 2/3 of it unless it's as the only way to escape, just catastrophic climate change. Then in 2013, the same group put another report out, at this time saying that not only can't we use the stuff that we know is out there in the ground, we've got to really slow down using the stuff we already have. So it kind of changes the whole tenor of their quote, which is one of the techniques that we talked about, is that quotes are legitimate, but you got to be really leery of them because they're often taken out of context, which obscures their real meaning. So let's get to the rules themselves. The document starts off admitting that there are many areas that aren't even addressed yet. In fact, they list 22 areas that are still under consideration. Some of them are pretty important, like establishing a contingency fund to address future environmental problems that may occur, public disclosure of environmental assessment information, expanded air quality testing in the province, developing a water management strategy for oil and gas, and identifying additional wastewater treatment and disposal options. I particularly like the word of use additional there because right now there are literally no options for wastewater treatment. So these are the ones that they list. Plus there are other areas that aren't addressed either. For instance, nowhere does it tell you where the money is going to come to pay for the guaranteed many millions of dollars of road damage that will be caused by this industry. But they say it's all going to be completed in 2 years. Well, fine. But if you're missing important pieces on things like water management, air quality, wastewater treatment, it seems to me that it's a bit premature and pretty presumptuous to then go ahead and say, but we have the strictest regulations. Someday they may be the strictest, but right now they don't even cover a lot of important areas. And at best, some of them probably turn out to be strict and others won't. But strictness also implies how the regulations are enforced. It's another one of those how, why, where, when questions. Well, how will our regulations be applied? Well, in the province, here's my air quotes, this is from the document. It says, for the most part, they're going to be implemented as conditions to approvals of certificates and determination. In other words, if you go to apply for a permit to do something, they will choose from this laundry list of regulations to apply a condition to your permit. Well, the many implications to this. One is that they're not going to be applied uniformly to everybody. The second is that they can be changed. If you're looking for a permission, you can get a variance. And the public doesn't know about any of this. This all happens between the government and the industry. So you don't know what regulations are really in force. Fortunately, once again, the government has provided this with another example so that we don't have to make anything up. Just recently, the government gave a blanket variance of the wetland protection rules to Southwest Resources to go do seismic testing in wetlands. Now, none of these wetlands were examined individually by somebody from the Department of Environment. SWN just came in, made the request, filled out some forms, paid their money, and voila, they have a variance, which nobody would have known about except that some of the people who live in the area happen to notice these guys working in the wetlands. So this is the strictest. Once again, it's a little questionable. But really, when you get down to it, what does strictest mean? Strictest is a comparative word. Here's one of the things that is another critical thinking technique. Be wary of comparative words, because it has no meaning without knowing everything it's compared to. I mean, we can take Alberta, for instance, which is held up as the paragon of how to do oil and gas correctly. Well, in Alberta, they don't even require water wells to be tested if you're doing shale hydrofracking in the area. So New Brunswick does require that. So you could say, well, we're stricter than Alberta on this issue. But to say that we're the strictest, you'd have to compare every detail of the regulation to every other place that is doing this. Many of them at the same time also claim to have the strictest regulations. So it becomes basically pretty meaningless language. Well, maybe we say ours are the strictest because they're based on best practices. Well, here's another comparative word, best. I mean, if you look in the dictionary, best is not a synonym for effective or safe or scientifically sound. Best practices just means the best that can be done with the current technology and at a price that the industry is willing to pay. Because best practices are defined by the industry. They're the ones who call these things best practices. So they're made up in their interest. As a comparison, I like to say in the medical profession at various times in history, the best practices for several cures were to drill holes in somebody's skull or to apply leeches. So best just doesn't work. What you need to do is have scientifically valid practices. So using that as our context, and also that's a measurable criterion, we can look at some of our rules. The government brags that our rules on gas well setbacks are 3 times as tough as some other jurisdictions. Well, our rules for setbacks say that a gas well can be as close as 250 meters from a home or 500 meters from a hospital, a school, or a senior's retirement home. Well, when that regulation was written, the only long-term health study ever done on shale gas said that there were extremely high risk for cancer, for respiratory, for neurological diseases, and some others for people who lived within a half mile of a gas well. So here we have the example of a best practice that may be a best practice, but obviously did not reflect the scientific knowledge associated with it. We also say that our gas wells can be within 250, as close as 250 meters from a water well. Well, when that regulation was written, there were several peer-reviewed studies, plus a mountain of anecdotal evidence that says that there's a high risk of methane contamination of water wells if you're within a kilometer of a gas well. So once again, a best practice in the industry is not either up to the scientific standards or adequate to protect the people living by. And my final example for the day, as we draw this to a conclusion, Minister Leonard repeats this all the time as an example of how tough our regulations are. He says we have full disclosure of fracking fluid chemicals. Well, now is when I'm going to take you back to the example of the U.S. versus the Soviet Union car race, where the headline was true until you knew the context, and then it was not quite so. First, the total disclosure is only made to the regulatory agency. It's not made to the public. The public can't get access to any of these names of any of these chemicals until 30 days after frac is completed. If a chemical is claimed to be a trade secret, the public can never get knowledge of it. At best, the names of these can be given to first responders or medical health professionals if necessary for the protection of the public health, public safety of the environment. Generally speaking, if there's an accident or emergency. So, if you haven't seen the loophole in this already, I'll give it to you. If you don't know what the chemicals are before the frac, you can't test for them. You can't test for something you don't know. Now, New Brunswick does do water testing. It tests for a lot of naturally occurring chemicals, which is good. It tests for methane, which is good. And it tests for some general chemicals used in gas development, like benzene. But they don't test for chemicals that are used in fracking. So the result of this is that if a citizen doesn't know what's in there, he can't even pay for his own test, because you can't test for what you don't know. The result is that there is no baseline data should a health or environmental case come up in the future. That happens after the fact. Now, the industry will use, and has successfully used already in many places, has used this as a defense against contamination cases. Hey, there's no baseline data. You can't prove that it wasn't there before we started. So, and also there's no procedure described as to how a physician can get access to these chemicals that are trade secreted. And a physician can't make a diagnosis on something that they don't even know exists. So let's go back to the statement and say it's 100% disclosure. Well, true if you just looked at those few words, it's disclosed to somebody, but it's actually meaningless when applied to any kind of case that would involve a citizen's health or environmental problems. So, with what we've now learned from the language, the context, and our common sense, without getting into engineering specifications or heavy science, we can answer the question, can the strictest regulations based on best practices ensure safe and responsible development of shale gas? My conclusion, and the opinion based on everything we've just talked about, is that it cannot. There's no answer to the fundamental question of Why did this industry have to be deregulated before it even started? If you eliminate the toughest standards right at the get-go, how strict can the following regulations be? And so what we happen is that the government also enforces these too weakly. You know, they're too close to the industry. They're conflicted. You know, they want to protect the people and the environment, but at the same time, they want the revenues that come from the industry. And you have what's called regulatory capture, which is essentially, you know, the industry and the regulatory agency become one and the same. Regulations then become simply a cost of doing business, and they are broken, you know, with not much concern. Regulations, as we've seen some examples we mentioned already, haven't worked elsewhere. And New Brunswick regulations are no stricter. I mean, some may be better, some are probably worse, but compared to what? There are no standards defined. Every jurisdiction says they have the strictest regulations, which suggests that it's mostly a public relations strategy, probably suggested by the industry, because you see the same phrases used universally. The language is meaningless. Best practices is also a meaningless PR phrase. They're just simply what the industry can afford with using current technology. It's a cost-benefit decision that the industry makes, and many of them do not conform to the underlying science. Safe and responsible are never defined. I mean, there are no measurable criteria. What's that mean, to be safe and responsible? So I'm saying, in my opinion, that the government's claim that shale gas extraction can be done safely and responsibility isn't based on any measurable standards or on evidence from here or elsewhere. When they keep repeating this, it simply gives people a false sense of security. Now, the proof of this conclusion can once again be found by doing some ground truthing, by looking at what's happened elsewhere. Everywhere shale gas is extracted, everywhere, no matter what the regulations or how strict they're purported to be, you have the same number of health problems, you have the same kind of health problems, you have the same environmental problems, you have the same number of regulatory violations, essentially in the same number, which suggests that this cannot be done safely. That's one of the answers to the question of why did they deregulate it. It simply cannot be done safely. And there's some other evidence that would support this, in that things like leaking wells are happening at the same rate today as they were 12 years ago when the industry got started. There's been absolutely no improvement. In fact, some studies say it's gotten actually worse. And the other part of that equation is that if it's not because it can't be done safely, it's because the industry isn't willing to pay the money to do it safely. They both have the same result. But probably the greatest indicator of what I'm saying being true is that the greatest opposition to shale gas is not coming in places like New Brunswick. It's coming from places like Pennsylvania and Colorado, jurisdictions that have lived with this industry for a number of years. In Pennsylvania, currently, the Democratic Party has just adopted a call for a moratorium as part of their party platform. In Colorado, the cities and the state are suing each other over this issue. And in British Columbia, you know, the gas production is like hundreds of kilometers from any kind of population center. But even given that, 50% of a recent poll said that 57% of British Columbians do not want the shale gas industry. But these people were persuaded by the same language that is now being used to try and persuade us that everything is fine and dandy. Fortunately for us, we now can apply our critical thinking techniques to their experiences and learn from that. So to sum this all up, I hope you remember that whatever the subject, whether shale gas or not, you know, you can use common sense and a few critical thinking techniques to cut through the loaded language that you're faced with each day. It'll improve your life, and you know, you'll become a better informed citizen to make really important decisions that we are going to be making in the next year. Going to recap a few, and we'll come to the end then, is that one of the things you have to understand is about how important context is. A sentence can be true on its own, but entirely false in context, which means that sound bites and talking points are almost always misleading. You can almost guarantee it. The journalism rules, the who, what, where, why, when, and how, are really important, because the only way you can get that context to understand something that you don't experience yourself. I mean, none of us are you know, shale gas experts. You have to be wary of comparative language, and especially if comparative statistics are used. I have some wonderful examples that I don't have time to give you for that, but that's almost always is going to be misleading. What isn't said is as important as what is said. if you hear something and it leaves you with a question of your mind, you have to find out about that. You know, you have to get the whole story. You have to get definitions and criteria for making a judgment. I mean, how do you measure safe and responsible? Somebody tells you that, what's it mean? You can look for good analogies, which means, you know, look for similar situations elsewhere. You know, is their experience, you know, does that comport with what you see happening and what's being told to you? And finally, as much as possible, ground truth anything you hear, which means that, and you can't always do this, but where you can, you know, look up some real life examples, find out what's happening elsewhere, and see if that reality is what you're hearing in the language. So I'm going to end up here with starting you off on your first practice of how to use these critical skills that we just talked about. And it's going to use a little shale gas example here too, which is the other side of what the government uses to sell it. Besides it being safe and responsible, the other thing they sell is that you will hear constantly, this will bring us jobs. Okay, I can see that that's a perfectly true statement. This will bring us jobs. But applying those 7 or 8 techniques that we just talked about, immediately I think, how many jobs? What kind of jobs? Who will get these jobs? What skill levels are necessary? Are these permanent and full-time jobs? Are they safe jobs? Would other industries provide more or better jobs? Will these jobs really address New Brunswick's unemployment and economic problems? Will this industry kill jobs in other industries? And finally, what was the job experience in other places that had developed shale gas? So only when you have the answers to these questions and others that you come up with as you think about this, can you make a judgment on this issue and decide whether the government is telling you the truth or selling you a bill of goods. So good luck. Remember that many people are trying to influence you with language, including me, and thank you for your attention.